How should we understand the EU referendum? The natural position of the left, we are told, is Remain. The EU represents all that is good in the world: cooperation, internationalism, free movement, workers' rights and social democracy. It secures our human rights, and it's prevented Europe from sliding back into war. The only problem is, this simply isn't true. Rather than understand the vote as a choice of left versus right, it is better understood as a choice of the market versus society. And the EU is, without question, the market. The Remain campaign has been funded by Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley, three banking giants whose sole concern is unrestrained corporate profit. Remain is supported by the Bullingdon twins, George Osborne and David Cameron, two men who have spent the last 6 years attacking the disabled, privatising the NHS, slashing welfare, attacking union rights, assaulting the BBC and handing tax cuts to millionaires. Meanwhile, those highly educated social democrats across the water, the Norwegians, continue to strongly oppose joining the EU. Something just doesn't add up here. Does the left argument for Remain actually stand up? Or is the progressive vote actually to leave? The idea that leave is a right-wing position is a relatively modern one and fairly strange. Historically, it has been Labour that has opposed the EU and the Tories that have supported it.
The Labour Party has historically been very anti-EU. Even Jeremy Corbyn was elected on a manifesto in 1983 of leaving the common market.
I think some of the heroes of the trade union and labour movement in the past have been bitter opponents of the European Union, people like Tony Benn and Bob Crow and Peter Shaw and Michael Foot and people like that. And I think that's because they understood it was not an institution that was worker friendly, it was an institution that really was no friend of workers. And I think that's even more the case now than it ever was.
On this, there is no room for a scintilla of doubt. Mr. Benn was the finest, most eloquent advocate of British withdrawal from the European Union. He was the theoretician of the reasons why Britain should leave the European Union. And it frankly surprises me, more than surprises, that so many people who, if Mr. Benn was still alive today, would find it very difficult to march in the opposite direction to him, are completely disregarding that. Ditto the late and great Bob Crow. And I'll tell you this, if both of these men were still alive, they'd be in the front line of the left campaign to exit the European Union, and we'd be in a much stronger position in this debate than we even are now.
We had this bloody war which cost millions of lives, and then we had to decide how we reacted to Europe. And I took the view that having fought them, we should now work with them and cooperate. And that was my first thought about it. Then when I saw how the European Union was developing, it was very obvious that what they had in mind was not democratic. I mean, in Britain you vote for a government and therefore the government has to listen to you, and if you don't like it you can change it, but in Europe all the key positions are appointed, not elected.
Among the trade union movement, the RMT, ASLEF and the Bakers Union all back Brexit, as well as scores of trade unions across the continent. We were invited to a rally for Brexit in Paris last month, attended by 2,000 workers from across Europe.
L'Europe, Monsieur Juncker, ce n'est pas votre prison des peuples qui nous impose la loi El Khomri en France et nous matraque quand on manifeste. L'Europe, Monsieur Juncker, ce n'est pas votre Union européenne policière qui expulse les réfugiés qui fuient vos guerres en Syrie et en Afghanistan. L'Europe, Monsieur Juncker, ce n'est pas votre Union européenne capitaliste qui détruit tous nos droits en France, en Grèce, en Grande-Bretagne ou en Espagne. L'Europe, ce n'est pas l'Union européenne. Et c'est pour ça que nous disons « Vive les travailleurs britanniques qui vont voter pour quitter l'Union européenne le 23 juin ».
The idea that left-leaning voters should still naturally gravitate towards Remain is still very common. But let's stop for a moment and consider just a few of the reactionary, profoundly right-wing forces lining up for the Remain. So, who are the great workers' cooperatives funding the Remain camp? That brave grassroots movement standing up for the little people and for workers' rights and empowerment. Firstly, there's Goldman Sachs, a multinational which somehow manages to stand out as being particularly bloodthirsty and rapacious, even in an industry as cutthroat as banking. Next up funding the Remains are the lovable rogues at JP Morgan, a bank that has had to pay out around $30 billion in fines between 2009 and 2014 alone. Completing our trio of dodgy megabanks funding the Remain campaign, we have Morgan Stanley, who just this year paid $2.6 billion to settle claims related to mortgage securities.
Very surprised to learn that the Remain campaign is funded by Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan.
Well, is the Pope a Catholic?
I wasn't surprised at all to discover where the Remain camp has got most of its money from, the big banks, and particularly in the case of one or two of the big banks, those banks that actually were very, very involved in the terrible economic situation we had just a few years ago.
The Remain campaign tries to sort of frame itself, as progressive, universalist, cosmopolitan, again tied to that idea of the European social model, which A, doesn't really exist, B, is premised upon exploiting very poor countries in the global south. Not at all. This is about European capitalism. It's about an actor at the global stage which has pushed an agenda which favours the Goldman Sachs, which favours the Morgan Stanleys, which favours the Deutsche Banks and the HSBCs, right? So of course they would fund Britain to stay in the EU.
I don't see Remain being progressive in any way at all, to be blunt about it. I mean, is Cameron progressive? Is the Blairite faction inside the Labour Party, which are driving this whole Remain effort?
Every rotten, rapacious, exploiting capitalist corporation is striving might and main to persuade working people in Britain that they should vote to remain in the European Union. If that doesn't make you smell a rat, I mean, what would? These are giant rats, and they're running around in front of you.
So in reality, there is very considerable support for Brexit on the left, in Britain and around Europe. Historically, the Labour Party opposed the EU as an undemocratic business club, and it is undeniable that most of the world's most exploitative individuals, organisations and corporations are not just backing the Remain campaign, they're actually bankrolling. Let's start with an easy one, TTIP. Never heard of it? That might be because the EU is negotiating it in secret.
TTIP is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership that's being negotiated between the United States and the European Union.
Up until now, the detail of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership has been conducted in secret between the European Commission and the United States.
And I think that some of our members of the European Parliament in Scotland and the UK have to answer why they were prepared to go into a closed room agreeing to two conditions. One being that they took no notes of any kind, and secondly, that they were sworn not to tell us, their constituents, what they had in fact read.
I think people should be very alarmed because TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, is going to hand power, enormous amounts of power, to American corporations.
I think TTIP is a huge threat. It's probably the biggest threat to public services across Europe in living memory.
TTIP is the biggest shark in the water. It threatens it's an existential threat actually to everything that British people believe in, not least in the National Health Service, but not only in the National Health Service, in the whole concept of a public sector, of public service. TTIP is the great white shark in the water.
But essentially what we're seeing is a new generation of trade agreements that really go behind the border and start to interfere with policy space, what you can and cannot do in terms of regulation, prioritizing investor protection and the rights of companies over the democratic rights of citizens to set their own priorities and agendas. And so I think TTIP is an extreme version of this.
And it will give enormous power to companies to prosecute governments for loss of profits. So it will effectively put a brake take on any more public ownership. It would force some parts of the public services into the private sector. And we will see a world which is actually controlled by companies and not by democratically elected governments, which I think is a travesty and an absolute abrogation of democracy.
TTIP has a serious danger for the National Health Service as long as health is mentioned in it. It opens up the whole issues of bringing the mechanisms of TTIP into the health service.
It will mean that every US corporation will be legally entitled to bid for every service involved in Britain, whether that's a school, a university, a hospital, or any other kind of public service. And if it's not given the contract, will have the right to sue the British government to the point of national bankruptcy in protest at not being given the gig. Let me give you a concrete example. If the government were to do as it should and introduce measures to force corporations to cut the level of sugar in their product for health reasons, Coca-Cola could sue the British government for billions of dollars in lost profits, which would result. If a British government took action to clamp down on fracking or on genetically modified foods, the corporations involved in fracking and genetically modified foods could sue the British government for encroaching on their right to make a mega profit from both.
TTIP is sort of the future that our neoliberal elites would like for us, and the one that we should be very wary of and resistant of. And I think leave only helps. If we exit the European Union, we'll be at the back of the queue, we've been told by President Obama. Well, that's exactly where I'd like to be on those kinds of investor protections. Thank you very much.
The Greek case alone should be enough to remove any hint of doubt about the true nature of the EU. Greece has been utterly crushed. Its people, its government, its public sector, its referendum result, all crushed by the European Union. The most vicious austerity has been imposed, basic workers' rights like collective bargaining removed, public assets flogged off, and yet the bailout isn't for the Greek people, it's for the foreign banks who hold their debt.
Greece is a fascinating story. I think around 2011, the EU went from undemocratic to anti-democratic.
Greece scars my view of Europe. I don't make any secret of it.
When we see what's happened to Greece, when we see what's happened in Spain, in Portugal, and even in Ireland, we've seen that the European Union has been responsible for ending collective bargaining, for totally ignoring the democratic wishes of elected governments, and of imposing a form of rule which has not been asked for by the people of those countries.
Well, I'm pretty staggered that any socialist, anyone on the left, could look at what happened in Greece and still be in favour of sticking with the European Union.
2011, in the aftermath of, yes, the global financial crisis, but of course in a European context, the Eurozone crisis, the Greek sovereign debt crisis, you have the imposition, effectively by the Troika, right, of the Papademos government onto Greece. Right? They're deciding the governments of member states, effectively. You have something similar happen with Mario Monti the same year in Italy, right? Because they were so worried about Berlusconi. So you had the EU after 2011 moving from undemocratic to anti-democratic, choosing, effectively parachuting in governments, right? In the case of Greece, that was intensified even further with the referendum last year. You had the ECB. Now, the ECB is legally obliged to ensure monetary, fiscal stability, right? The ECB was trying to start effectively and run on Greek banks during the referendum on the third bailout deal, right? They were trying to start a run on banks. Now, why were they doing that? They were trying to undermine public confidence in the Syriza-led government. They were trying to undermine public confidence that there would be a calm, stable exit, potentially, of Greece from a set of deals, or the EU or the Eurozone. They were making it very clear, right? If you don't do as we say, right, there'll be trouble. What will it look like? It'll be catastrophic. Money won't be coming out of the banks, you know. It will look like the 1929 Wall Street crash. And when you've got a fascist party third in the polls, that really scares people, right? Yanis Varoufakis, on the day of the vote, called it terrorism. He was calling people around the ECB terrorists. This same guy is now campaigning for a different EU. I mean, You don't get more contradictory thinking.
Greeks have been treated absolutely appallingly. When you think that they've got now 25% unemployment, the equivalent in Britain would be 7.5 million people without jobs. That's in Greece now. We've seen 25% cut in living standards, so working class people have seen their living standards savagely cut. And they've had, they've put a brake on collective bargaining, so workers can't bargain for better wages because of austerity and the bailout deal. So, I think they've been treated absolutely appallingly.
And when there were riots on the streets and when there were protests at the effects of that austerity, and when the Greeks elected a left-wing government, Syriza, they really wanted to fight back and challenge the EU's imposed austerity. And then when that was put to them in a national referendum and they voted decisively against the bailout package, which have imposed even more crippling austerity, far from being brought to heel, the EU establishment, which was part of the Troika in the negotiations with the IMF and the European Central Bank, was very bullish and said, whatever you say in Greece, you're having this whether you like it or not. We couldn't care less about your referendum. We couldn't care less about democracy. You're not going to set a precedent. You're not going to blaze a path for every other group of people around the EU who want to challenge austerity. We're going to make an example of you. And they ground the noses of the Greeks into the dust.
So, the EU is trying to sign a secret deal with US corporations, and it is trying to crush elected governments and impoverish people throughout Europe with its ideological obsession with austerity. And austerity, let's not forget, is legally enshrined in EU directives on the size of deficits government can run. What other treats for workers is the EU busying itself with? Well, privatising train services across Europe, for one thing.
If people think that rail services on the continent of Europe are all publicly owned, they need to get out more, because it's not the case. And in fact, what we're seeing is that the British experiment is now being rolled out across the other 26 member states of the European Union. Malta doesn't have a railway, but the other 26 are getting it in spades, and we're seeing huge numbers of job losses in particularly the former socialist countries. In Romania, in Bulgaria, there have been tens of thousands of railway workers who've been put into the job market, made unemployed by the sharp contraction in their rail industries. It's quite a shocking scale of cutbacks that are going on, and this really isn't being understood. What we're seeing is the destruction by the European Union of the most developed, the most interlinked and the most international railway system that has ever been developed in the history of the railway industry.
Well, in 2019, the fourth railway directive, which is an EU directive, will be coming in, and that makes it compulsory for private enterprise to be allowed to bid to run and own the railways.
The fourth rail package makes it actually the opposite of that. They've brought in regulations that say that you've got to separate wheel from steel, i.e. can only the infrastructure, which is the tracks and signals, or you can own the train operating companies, but not both. So really what we're going to have is the British example, which is the poorest performing and most expensive per kilometre in the entire European Union, being exported to other countries in Europe. You would have thought that they would have tried to bring the most efficient system in, which is a nationalised system, but in fact they're doing the opposite. So they can open up markets which have previously been closed to private capital.
And eventually the Labour government was forced to take back the infrastructure into state ownership before reprivatising it. But this is being copied now in Europe. One of the fascinating things that's happening in France at the moment is there's a national rail strike taking place. That national rail strike has been sparked because the European Union has told SNCF that they have to make French rail workers who are employed by the national rail company, SNCF, more competitive in terms of their employment contracts with the private sector rail workers in France who are employed by a number of different private companies. There are many private railway companies in France. Perhaps 25% of France's freight rail freight is moved by private companies, not by SNCF. So it's a myth that France is a redoubt of 100% public ownership. What you have, in fact, is a very fierce competition, and the result of that competition is to drive down wages and to drive down hard-won workers' conditions amongst railway workers in France and in other European countries.
Now, Jeremy Corbyn said in the leadership election that he wants to bring the railways back into public ownership. Most opinion polls now show that there is a significant majority across the country that want to see that happen. So the choice really for the next Labour government is, do we stay in the European Union, or do we do what the British people want and bring the railways back into public ownership? I know what I'd like to see. I don't want to be spending £72 every day coming into London. I'd like to see our railways brought back into public ownership, prices down and services improved. And the only way we can do that, frankly, is if we leave the European Union.
We've seen a similar story with postal services. EU directives were the unspoken story behind the privatisation of Royal Mail. The EU's current Postal Services Directive is explicitly and openly committed to privatising postal services across Europe. As in so many areas, the EU legislates to create a single market. The clue is very much in the name. Nationalised services have no place in this market. Another of Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto commitments was opposing austerity, the disastrous decision to ignore the economic lessons of history and slash the public sector and welfare payments to compensate the banks for their reckless and criminal profiteering. What is the EU's position on austerity? It's a very active and aggressive enforcer.
Look at the EU's Stability and Growth Pact, which says that a member state cannot run a deficit, budget deficit of more than 3% of GDP, then that limits very severely what governments can do to overcome recession.
They have a legal definition of what your current account deficit can be. They have a legal definition of what your levels of public debt can be. And if you breach them, you'll be crushed. And therefore, they have outlawed not just socialism, they've outlawed Keynesianism, the very thing that saved us from the utter destruction of the Depression of the 1930s. FDR would be acting illegally if the United States had been in the European Union.
The question must be asked, why are left-leaning voters around Britain supporting an unelected institution staffed by former Goldman Sachs bankers, committed to privatising rail services, committed to privatising postal services, committed to repealing workers' rights, to enforcing austerity, to crushing countries like Greece when they defy them, and to ignoring democratic results when they don't get their own way?
Since 1992, since Maastricht, the political economy of the EU, its trajectory is undeniably neoliberal.
Well, it's about markets, and from the beginning, when it was called the common market, it's about markets. It's about reducing the involvement of government in the economy and increasing the control of banks and private companies and driving towards a market. So I think it's a subset of neoliberalism in reality, and that it has been that from the beginning. I think there were many on the right who resented very much the social democratic world created after the Second World War, and they wanted piece by piece to dismantle it, and that's precisely what's happening now.
We're internationalists in our outlook, but the European Union is not an internationalist organisation. It's an aggressive trading bloc that's set up there to establish and reinforce imperialist hegemony over other countries and other trading blocs, and to pretend that this is some sort of left-wing project and somehow it can be reformed. It's like feeding a tiger apples and oranges and hoping it's going to become a vegetarian. It's just not designed that way.
It's a neoliberal institution which is driving neoliberalism. It's sometimes argued that there's neoliberalism everywhere, and that's true, but the EU as an institution is absolutely central to driving the neoliberal project.
My opposition to the EEC was that the Treaty of Rome, and it applies to all subsequent treaties, enshrines the ethic of capitalism, that it has the right to move wherever it wants to, irrespective of the damage done to a community.
Capitalism is written in, no, chiseled in, not just etched, but chiseled in to the Constitution of the European Union. Indeed, as Mr. Benn once said, the European Constitution is the only one in the entire world where the existence of monopoly capitalism is written in to the Constitution itself.
The United Kingdom is the 5th largest economy in the world. We are now trading outside the EU more than we trade with the EU. The EU trades with us. The Germans sell us huge amounts of cars. We would not be penalised by those countries because they would be, I think the expression, cutting off their nose to spite their face. They need us more than we need them. And I'm very confident that if we were to leave, we would get agreements with other countries.
I think that's nonsense. It's scare tactics by the Remain camp. The reality is that Britain is an enormous economy and we buy £60 billion more from the EU than we sell to the EU. So we're a massively important market for the rest of the EU, particularly for Germany. So the idea that they would attack us in trade terms, I think, is laughable and complete nonsense. I think we would carry on trading as before, and indeed I want to see us rebuilding our manufacturing so we have to start to sell more rather than simply buying in too much.
Britain is a net contributor to the European Union. It costs us billions of pounds every year to be a member of the European Union. I think that the trading deals, especially with mainland Europe, aren't going to be that much affected. I think we take more from them and we actually export to them anyway.
We don't need trade agreements to actually trade with countries. We don't have trade agreements with China, the European Union doesn't. We don't have trade agreements with India, the European Union doesn't. We can trade, America trades with the European Union and they don't have a trade agreement. So it's all being sort of stirred up as if there's somehow this enormously important thing called a trade agreement.
As things stand, Britain's trade with the EU is falling and rising with the rest of the world. At the same time, the EU's share of world trade continues to fall and is now down to just 16%.
We are told that reputable institutions like the IMF, the Bank of England, the OECD, the Treasury and the White House have all come out for Remain. How seriously should we take these warnings?
Oh, stop it. The further you went on with that list, the more I was tempted to burst out laughing. Well, first of all, the first of the institutions that you refer to are the very people who told us that joining the euro was indispensable for us. All these predictions of ruin, by the way, that are being made by the Remain camp if we come out of the EU, every one of these arguments was made if we failed to join the euro. And how's that gone? It was the best decision we ever made, was not to join the euro, which has been the ruination of entire countries. So their track record on economic forecasting, frankly, is laughable. These are institutions which failed to see the crash in 2008, which almost took our entire country's economy over the cliff to destruction.
Remember that the very same threats were made to try to bully the Norwegians into joining the EU in their referendums in 1974 and 1994.
That was a technique that was being used by the yes side in '94. We were told that we would lose 50,000 jobs nearly overnight if we didn't join, and the fisheries would lose out tremendously, and you know, all these sectors that would be ruined economically if we didn't say yes, and obviously that didn't happen. Again, I think it's really important that people in this debate, that's, you know, the ordinary people in the street need to feel confidence, and they must have the knowledge about the facts, because otherwise it's very easy to just be you know, blown away by all these all the rhetorics.
They really lied. They really exaggerated as much as they could. They said we will lose 100,000 jobs. Nobody would invest in Norway. The interest rate would go to the skies. We would be isolated. Nobody would speak to us. I mean, they said all those kinds of things, which has proved false, all of them, because Norwegian economy has really gone to the top after 1994. Investments, interest rate is low. We have the lowest unemployment rate in Europe. So this was all false. And happily enough, they didn't reach the majority with those lies.
The Common Fisheries Policy, the British public understand it's about conserving fish stocks. Nothing could be more wrong than that. The Common Fisheries Policy is equal access to a common resource.
The CFP is basically supposedly equal access to everybody else's commodities with your partners within Europe. 70% of all the European quota is caught in our waters, of which only 14% is caught by UK fishermen.
Oh, the CFP is a complete and utter disaster. I think you'd struggle to find anybody that would say the CFP has been good. Maybe good for certain individuals, but in the main, it's been pretty dramatic. It's caused a dramatic reduction in the fleet, and it has hurt areas, fishing areas and coastal communities all around the UK.
Major changes. If you look at my home port of Loo, just behind us here, it's gone from 35 trawlers when I started fishing in Loo to now I think there's 6 or 7.
Since we joined the CFP, the fleet is diminished around the UK 64%.
I mean, the changes, if I can think back to when I was a young boy, my dream was always to be a fisherman and become a fishing skipper. That was from I was 4 or 5 years old. That was the focus. My whole life has been about fishing, and I've seen this port of Peterhead turning from a huge bustling port. It was just a hive of activity to pretty much, let's look at it now, quiet, and we're still fighting for our cause, and we still produce good fish, but it's a shadow of its former self.
And if you go all the way down Cornwall and see where there aren't any boats anymore, and there's no up and coming young people coming into this business, it doesn't only affect the fishermen, it affects porters, it affects processors, it affects us having staff in our shop, retail, delivery, you know, polyboxes, you name it, whatever, anything that we use in this industry is going to affect.
I arrived in Peterhead from Scarborough in the northeast of England in 1985, and when I arrived here there was in the region of 600 vessels fishing out of Peterhead, between Aberdeen, Peterhead and Fraserburgh, we're in the region of 230 processors. If we fast forward to today, we are looking at roughly around about 70 dedicated whitefish vessels for Scotland and 60 processors in the whole of Scotland.
Common fisheries policy has been a noose round our neck for years.
The rule of thumb used to be for every one man fishing at sea, there were 6 jobs on shore. I mean, you had the region of, say, upwards of 20,000 people going to sea. You know, so you fast forward to today, I think, I don't know, there's maybe 1,500 fishermen, and the jobs on shores will become a micro industry for no fault of our own. But at least with Brexit, we will have a say in our own destiny. As it stands just now, with us having 70% of the quota, we have no say. We have to rely on an unelected EU representative to fight our corner for us. And we don't believe they're doing a good enough job for us.
They're on a career move. That's all they're concerned about. They're not concerned about the communities that we work and live in. And we're left to pick up the pieces. And there comes a point that you've had enough nonsense, and this is the point. We have a referendum, we have an option to tell the rest of the European Council of Ministers and all the rest of them, we've had enough, we're stepping back, we're still going to remain your best pals, but we will do our own thing.
The fishing community around the whole of Scotland and even the whole of the UK are all wanting out.
So all of their rules, we understand what it's like to be fully controlled by Europe. All of my daily life is controlled by European law, and there's so many and they're so ridiculous, it's unbelievable.
I'm going to vote for leave because it's the EU, the policies that have decimated our fishing industry, without a doubt, destroyed it. 20 years ago we had 37 trawlers here, we have 7 trawlers here now.
In fact, I believe we will become a stronger nation because we've got the products and the skills and the mentality to survive. We're the 5th biggest economy in the world, you know, so why wouldn't we survive?
I see Iceland thriving, I see Norway thriving on fish that they have their own quotas, they can sit at the table and get their own quota, so they get a decent slice of the quota pie, where we don't have a seat at the table. We're part of a massive organisation, but we're one of the small players in that organisation, which is the EU.
Norway gets a fantastic deal because they have a seat at a table where the decisions are made. The UK has a 12th, approximately, because roughly there's 12 nations that's interested in fishing, and they have to all to whisper in the ear of one EU commissioner at the table when all the quotas and things are being discussed. We have no say, or very little say, in negotiations.
The problem with Europe, for me, I've been to Europe several times and presented work to Europe and tried to give them good advice. And the problem with Europe is the project of what they want to achieve is more important than the outcomes it delivers.
I heard there's a poll out yesterday, there's 92% of fishermen want to leave the EU.
There's a huge consensus to leave. I haven't met a fisherman yet who's wanting to stay in.
We will unleash the innovative, creative ability that we have as a nation, our natural innovative and creative ability. It'll be unleashed by just political freedom. And when you do that to any country in the world, you unleash that country's potential.
Well, the main change is from it being the biggest fishing port in the world, it's now almost on its knees. We've gone from when I started some 50 years ago to having in excess of 600 boats that were fishing the world. We're down to about half a dozen now fishing the inshore waters. So it's been devastating. There's been thousands of jobs lost and never will be replaced.
Well, I actually had a Japanese newspaper come round the other week, and their view is that in London, in the bubble if you like, it's not really affected anybody since 2008, and people are more or less 50-50, maybe a little bit more remain. But they came here and they couldn't find anybody to do a balanced article who wanted to remain.
There are certain tests of a democracy. The United Kingdom passes them, the European Union does not. And these tests are, do you know who makes legislation, initiates legislation and implements legislation? Do you know the members of the European Parliament? Do you know the members of the Council of Ministers who make the final decisions on European law? Do you know the members of the European Court of Justice? Are you able, if you wish to do so, to unseat these people and make them accountable to you? The answer is no, none of those apply. The European Commission are 28 people who is an elite, an unelected elite. They initiate laws and they implement laws. If you went out and asked any citizen, who are they? The answer would be, I don't know. Ask them who Lord Hill is, for example, and you get puzzlement. We have an unelected Lord Hill who is the unelected British Commissioner in Brussels. If you ask them, can you unseat the European Commission? Well, the answer is no, we can't. So when you apply the tests of democracy to the European Union, it fails not just a little, it fails spectacularly.
Everybody's been talking about how the European Union has a democratic deficit for decades. So what does that mean? It means that we have a parliament, sure. That parliament's incredibly weak. Yes, we vote for it, but it's incredibly weak. The Scottish Parliament has more competences, more powers invested in it than the European Parliament. That's the elected bit. The Commission is the unelected bit. Now, some people are quite disingenuous about this, and they say the Commission is like a civil service. It's like Whitehall. That's just not true. The Commission has a real agenda-setting power when it comes to the EU. So it's very different to Whitehall, and that's an important power, agenda setting, right? Very important power. It's when we talk about the executive or functions of government, agenda setting is one of them, right? So it has executive powers. It's not just purely a bureaucracy. In terms of the commissioners, so the whole thing's undemocratic.
We don't get to vote for anyone within the European Union that has any real power. We have a European Commission that is wholly unelected, yet they have the power to initiate legislation that affects the lives of hundreds of millions of people across the European Union.
So you know, when you're talking about British trade policy, I'm sure there's lots of people and they look at what's going on in countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Big part of that is trade policy, right? Big driver of that, as I've already said, is the EU. Now, Brits who are upset about that, Germans who are upset about that, or French or Italian or Spanish nationals who are upset about that, well, tough luck. There's nothing you can do about it, right? Because nobody votes for the commissioner. Nobody, right? So how is he accountable to you? How could you vote him or her out? You can't. I mean, there is no definition of democracy which internalises that kind of logic. I mean, it's just a complete farce.
The European Parliament has no right to initiate or to repeal that legislation. It can tweak, it can rubber stamp, but effectively that's a fig leaf for democracy.
The way that power is distributed among the institutions of the European Union, and I lived in Brussels and saw this close up for a number of years, gives a great deal of power to the nominees of the member state governments. In some ways, you might want to think about the European Commission as a sort of commitment technology for governments that want to escape accountability to their own citizens and are able then to point at this unelected body that wields power over so many of the European competencies.
They can discuss things, they vote on things, but nothing can ever be started. Legislation cannot start from the European Parliament. It's only the commissioners who have the power to introduce legislation and to change things. And of course, so many of the directives that go through and the regulations that we then are forced to take have got nowhere near the European Parliament. And
I mean, the idea that the European Union is a happy, clappy haven for workers' rights is complete nonsense.
Well, it's certainly an argument I've heard over and over again, and it doesn't actually get any more compelling each time I actually hear it. The truth is, the national minimum wage was a UK demand from the trade union movement. It was fought for and it was won and enshrined in the UK Parliament. the same as equal pay. That was fought for in the UK and through the UK Parliament. There are many bits of progressive legislation that stem from UK action.
This is an absurd proposition, you know. It overestimates the civilizing mission that the EU represents and underestimates our own people. It presupposes that we had no rights before we joined the European Union in 1973, and that's simply not true. We had rights that European workers did not have, and we had them because we either voted for them or we won them through trade union action, or a combination of them both. And both are still options for us today.
The European Union has added to certain rights and legal laws, but those have all been put into our legislation. So if we were to leave the European Union, those would still be enshrined in British law, and it would take a completely separate piece of legislation to do anything about reducing those, and I don't believe that that will happen.
Now, given the strength of the feminist movement and the strength of Middle England, I doubt very much, say on maternity and paternity leave, whether any government of any persuasion would have the stupidity to try to change those laws.
We do not need an unelected bureaucracy to tell us, okay, you can have these rights, hang on. So they're taking the power to defend these rights away from us and saying, oh, we'll defend you. Well, hang on, what's this about? We can defend ourselves. And once you give away the power to defend yourself to someone else, you know they can stop defending you. And as I say again, look at Greece. Were they defended? No.
I'm a socialist with a trade union background. I used to be the head of the organisation of the Scottish TUC when I was much younger. If you look at the Viking judgment, which came before the European Court of Justice, there was a Finnish passenger ferry company paying high Finnish level wages. It wanted to change its flag from Finland to Estonia, so that it could employ Estonia workers at very much lower rates than Finnish workers and therefore improve its profitability. The Finnish workers decided to take collective action. They were backed by the International Maritime Union, who is opposed to flags of convenience. It ended up before the European Court of Justice.
I think the Viking and the Laval cases were interesting and in many ways very damaging to the interests of trade unions.
That court had to balance between the right of capital to move and the right of workers to take collective action to stop it moving. The European Court of Justice not only came down on the employers on the right of capital to move anywhere it wanted within the EU under treaty law, but it actually said that the right to collective action by workers is not an absolute right. So from a socialist and trade union point of view, I want out of that kind of organisation.
I think it's pretty obscene actually that judges sitting in a court in Europe can determine what trade unions in Britain can and can't do, and what action is legitimate and what action isn't legitimate.
There is no status quo in the EU. It is constantly expanding, grabbing new powers, growing more unbalanced, more unstable. It does not have democratic support, the Eurozone crisis cannot be resolved and looks set to get even worse. More countries are joining, and the migrant crisis has already had serious implications like the effective suspension of the Schengen Agreement, a core pillar of the EU. It is not remotely safe. The truth is, no one knows what the EU will look like in 2 years' time, let alone 10 or 20.
We are being dragged down by the Eurozone. This is a stagnant area of world economy, Europe these days, and it'll go on being like that because the Eurozone crisis is not about to end. Eurozone collapse lurks all the time. You won't have to believe me, believe the former governor of the Bank of England. He's quite clear. The Eurozone crisis will continue. Eurozone collapse will happen unless there's a fiscal transfer union. You can only get a fiscal transfer union with a much greater integration and, in effect, a country called Europe.
I think the EU at the moment is a train heading very fast in a very dangerous direction. You've only to look at the politics of places like Hungary and Austria, soon France, to see that there's a rising fascist tide within Europe that's understandable in the context of a set of constraints that give us deflation, austerity, limits on democratic accountability and participation. And so the idea that by simply staying within the European Union, we're not going to be heading in a very dangerous direction rather quickly, I think is deeply misguided. We need to get off this train, and we need to start helping others to get off this train before it starts delivering us into some cataclysmic circumstances that might even come to resemble the 1930s.
The EU's not standing still, it's getting deeper, it's enshrining the neoliberal policy deeper and deeper into the treaties, and therefore one of the things that TTIP are going to do is going to be to rip up a lot of the rights that have already been won. Getting out of the EU is the way to secure those rights.
A lot of nonsense is spouted about immigration and about immigrants themselves, but it should go without saying that the pressures mass immigration can bring are nothing to do with the migrants as individuals. They are the fault of no one but the British and European authorities. That said, there are structural issues that need to be addressed, and it should be understood that free movement is, at its core, a neoliberal attack on labour, on bargaining power, and on wage rates.
I think trade unions need to be braver. Trade union leaders need to be braver about the issue of open borders. They've been far too silent about it. I think you start from the position of saying, look, anybody who's in your country, regardless of where they've come from, you defend them, you expect equal treatment for them. As a trade union official, I want them organised into trade unions, fighting for better pay and conditions for them. And you absolutely oppose attacks on immigrants on a personal level. You certainly oppose any kind of racism. But there's no contradiction between that and also saying, but look, we've got a policy of open borders, which is having an effect on our communities, which is putting pressure on public services, which is, if you read some of the evidence, leading to the undercutting of wages. And that is not to blame immigrants personally, that's simply to recognise that governments and EU commissioners have made decisions that have not been in the interests of working people, and also to recognise that, look, the mass free movement of labour can be as disruptive in some cases to local communities as the free movement of capital. We need to understand that. And trade union leaders, I think, have been too silent about that up until now.
I think Labour voters have gone over to UKIP because they feel as though we're not listening to their concerns, particularly on immigration. There are communities up and down the country where there's been significant change and additional pressure placed on public services. Not all pressure on public services is because of immigration, but it is a contributing factor, as well as wage compression and competition for jobs. The Labour Party really needs to look at this and re-engage with those voters who are concerned about these issues.
Well, I think free movement of labour is really about bringing wages down and reducing bargaining power. Because if you've got a reserve army of labour, of competition for jobs, it means that employers can pay less and make more profit. That's what it's really about.
This, along with the austerity the EU is imposing across Europe, has fueled the rise of the far right. The EU is anything but stable. The only way it could resolve its problems is complete fiscal union, and that means political union, a country called Europe. And the people of Europe will not let that happen, making this fundamentally a doomed project. Leaving the European Union doesn't just mean getting back around £200 million a week to spend on our priorities. It means regaining the power to make our own laws, to elect those who govern us and to get rid of them if we don't like them, to nationalise our railways if we so choose, to bring our postal service back into public ownership. We regain the power to rebuild a fully nationalised NHS in public hands, to strike our own trade deals around the world with whoever we wish, and to say no to austerity. We regain the power to be an independent nation.
I've got faith in British workers to be able to defend themselves and advance their own working conditions outside of the European Union. One thing I find interesting is, you know, many people on the left who are arguing for a Remain vote on the grounds that they don't think that British workers at the moment are in a position to be able to defend themselves against the Tory government outside of the EU. And yet often these are the same people who would support any uprising or revolution or any example of workers across the world overthrowing undemocratic power. In a heartbeat they would support all of those instances. And yet for British workers they say no, we need to hold fire, we're not quite ready because we've got a nasty old Tory government who might take advantage of us. And I think really that shows a bit of contempt for British workers. I think British workers are more than capable of defending themselves. And in fact, if you look at most of the advances that have been made by working people in Britain over the years, those advances have come about through the UK Parliament as a result of trade union campaigns. So the national minimum wage, trade union recognition, health and safety at work, equal pay. I think the argument that, you know, we need to depend on the EU to give us workers' rights is completely overblown. We've shown in the past we're more than capable of defending ourselves, and we can do that in the future.
If the UK outside the EU offered, and you might think this is so unlikely, okay fine, well so is democratising the EU, so hear me out. If it could create a different model outside of the EU, at odds with neoliberalism, that would be absolutely huge. Why would it be huge? Because the international finance institutions, the IMF, the WTO, the World Bank, these are the daddies when it comes to globalisation. And the prize here is not a different kind of Britain, it's a different kind of globalisation. Now only a couple of countries can make that happen. Only a couple of countries. Britain and the US, in combination, probably do it. Okay? So I think that this project of leaving the EU, a different kind of economy, different kind of politics, has consequences for us here, the 63 million people here, but also I think it could be the beginning of a different kind of globalisation. Yeah, maybe it's unlikely, maybe it's improbable. It's a hell of a lot more likely than democratising the European Commission anytime soon. I can absolutely guarantee you that.
But we were not nothing, you know, before we joined the European Union in 1973. I was lucky enough, or unlucky enough now because it means I'm old, to have lived through Britain in the 1960s when we were really, really something. In fact, Britain, you could argue, was the centre of the world in the 1960s, and that was before we joined the European Union. We introduced reforms in the 1960s that were decades before their time in most European countries and in the European Union. We had a coal industry, a steel industry, a shipbuilding industry, an aviation industry. We built Concorde. We had the city of London, and the West End of London was the cultural capital of the whole world, all before we joined the European Union. I find it insulting to the British to hear us described as some kind of basket case only kept afloat by the European Union. Now I know that when we save £350 million a week, as we would if we leave, that Conservative politicians will want to spend that £350 million a week in a different way to what I would. But I would spend it on making Britain great again, not to hand out in tax cuts to the richest people, but in making Britain great again. And I believe it could be. I believe that the world can be our oyster, that we can reconnect with the Commonwealth that we shamefully abandoned when we joined the European Union, some of whose economies have now become the biggest and most thriving, burgeoning economies in the world. We can link up wholeheartedly with the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Iran, and many others that are where it's at rather than where it used to be. I believe that the European Union is a collection of failing, fading economies. Of course, it will still have cultural weight. I'll still be happy I'm a European. I'll still love Europe. I want to leave the club, not leave Europe. I just want to leave the capitalist club.
What it can begin is a different kind of conversation around the country we want to become, the Europe we want to have, right? Politically, economically, more democracy, more people having ownership over their lives, right? In an economic sense. That's all we're voting on. We're voting on membership of the EU. We're not voting on these other things. So if you have a problem with it, if you think it's undemocratic, go with your gut, vote to leave. That's what matters most. Do not be put off by the IMF, David Cameron, Goldman Sachs, okay? They obviously don't have your interests at heart. Let's make a dent into globalisation. Let's make a dent into neoliberalism. You might not agree with it. I think that's how we do it. Let's get out of this thing.
Britain is one of the richest countries in the world. We are a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. We are a leading member of NATO, of the G7, of the G20. We are the financial centre of the world. We have a worldwide cultural reach, and our soft power is second to none. Before we joined the EU, we were one of the most successful states in human history. The country of Shakespeare, Newton, Magna Carta, parliamentary democracy, global trade and the rule of law. Britain is not a child that needs sheltering from the world. We want Britain to be out in the world, not stuck within a decaying and undemocratic EU. Britain will always be proudly European, and part of what it is to be European is to stand up to unaccountable power, to stand for values like democracy, justice and fairness. That is Europe at its best. Unfortunately, on all those counts, the European Union fails. That is why we must vote leave, and lead the way with our European friends, and blaze the trail for a new Europe, a better Europe, a democratic Europe. Vote to leave on June the 23rd.